Welcome to today's session of the Business and Trade Committee as we commence our work on the EU reset and the publication a bit later on this year of our first stock take report. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses for coming in. Do you just want to just introduce yourself, just give us one line of introduction just for the record, Alastair?
Alastair Gunn, Trade Policy Lead at the Road Haulage Association.
Thank you, Julian.
Julian Walker, Associated British Ports Chief Commercial Officer.
Great, thank you, Toby.
Toby Ovens, Managing Director of Broughton Transport.
Brilliant. Right, thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, Alastair, let me start with you. So, do you think that Brexit has actually delivered what people were promised? Because when we're looking at the numbers, we see an economy that looks like it's 8% smaller as a result. We've got an investment rate that's a bit lower. We've got a goods trade that is down 18% on 5 years ago. Food and drink down 24%. 16,500 firms have stopped trading altogether with Europe. It looks like our traders are filling in about 1 million forms every 9 days, and the paperwork costs appear to be costing traders about £8.5 billion a year. So all of that sounds like it's made trade an awful lot harder. But what's the feedback from your members?
Well, thank you, Chair, for inviting us and inviting one of our members along, Toby, who will be able to speak to this as well. I'd agree certainly with the point about the cost for hauliers and the difficulties in moving goods that we've experienced, certainly post the Trading Cooperation Agreement coming in. There are huge delays at borders which cause significant costs, not just for hauliers, but of course for those traders who are our customers who are there to serve. We move across the UK 82% of goods, so we serve pretty much every sector within the UK. And yes, certainly our members are finding it extremely difficult now to move goods into and out of the European Union. We serve the European economy too.
Toby, could you just try and help us understand what this looks like in practice then for your staff? So Alastair says in his language there's huge delays. It'd be interesting just to see if you agree with that. But also, I mean, just like what does it mean in practice? Kind of describe a journey that goes smoothly and a journey that doesn't for us.
So obviously before Brexit there were no controls. It was literally a case of we board the Channel Tunnel, we get off the Channel Tunnel and we go. Now at the loading point there are frequent delays, waiting for vets, waiting for paperwork to be done, completed, stamped. This is then sent to the border for approval, and then the abattoirs, which is our sort of main business, wait for the approval to come back saying that the paperwork is in order. Then the vehicle's released and we proceed to Eurotunnel or Dover. When we get off the ferry or Channel Tunnel, we then have to go to a border point, border control post called CIVEP in France, which delays can range from 2 hours on a good day to our worst experiences a matter of 27 days, I think was the worst.
27 days?
Yeah. And that was, we actually left the trailer in the border post and were changing drivers, bringing drivers back. And that was all because...
Describe that. So you've got basically a truck that is parked up in a customs post.
Yeah.
And you're literally having to ferry...
drivers to babysit the trailer, in essence, to make sure the trailer doesn't run out of fuel, keeping the goods chilled.
Almost a month?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what were they transporting?
That was a load of meat, a load of frozen meat, luckily, not fresh meat. So obviously the dates weren't too much of an issue, but if it was fresh meat, it would have been an issue. But all that was just down to a paperwork error, which nobody goes out of their way to do. But it was, not a very good time, which is obviously we're charging our customer for that driver and trailer to be sat there. And the invoice totaled just over £16,000 to the customer for the vehicle sat there for a month, best part of.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just jump in very briefly. I had an example of this in my constituency with a haulier who was taking lamb carcasses to France, and that seemed correct. And they experienced difficulties. Now, they were clear that their paperwork was in order, but they felt that it was bloody mindedness on the other side of the EU. In your experience, does that go on?
Yes.
There was an issue with, I believe, a patch of wool on one of the carcasses, and the whole thing came to a halt. And again, a lengthy delay of the kind you're talking about. But so you think that some of it is mistakes happen in any walk of life. Some of it's on our side, but you think there's an issue on the other side as well.
Yeah, we have had instances of customers when they question a decision from a border control post, almost being told to back off, or it can be a bit worse. It can be worse. The majority of the issues, and I would say probably 99% of the issues, are paperwork issues, not problems with the meat or whatever else it may be. And just for a paperwork issue, I'd like to give you some idea. Like, for instance, this was what we needed before Brexit. Yeah. One piece of paper. This is a trailer which is actually leaving the UK today. Stamps, and all we've got to have is a stamp in the wrong place, or without a signature next to it, or a line not crossed properly through one form, and that trailer will be rejected in Calais and returned to the UK.
How many stamps are on that pile of paper?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 22, 24, 26 on that one. And that's just one. There's three certificates for that trailer.
Mistake.
So one mistake. Like, I've had vets chasing lorries down the M4 because they've suddenly realised they haven't put a stamp in the right place on a piece of paper.
Good grief.
And if the vehicle makes it to Calais, then obviously once it's across the border, we've then got to try and return it to the UK, which means then applying to the APHA for permission to return the trailers to the UK, which can take up to 2 weeks sometimes. And that was one of the issues that Mikey Kerr...
Which means that Kerr's experienced, so their vehicle was in France, had to come back, and they had a delay on the British side. And
how are you still in business?
I've lost a lot of hair over the last few years. It is a real challenge, and it's nothing like it used to be. It's, December, which is our busiest month of the year, was, I'd go just as far as describing pure hell, with problems with paperwork and just trailers being delayed. We had the issue with Mikey Kerr, who I get on very well with, and there aren't many of us that do the job, and there's lots of people that have pulled out of the international meat transport side of things because of the and I think if I was a bit older and not quite as I'd have to seriously think about it with the challenges that we face.
We'd forgive you for that decision. Okay, thank you very much. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've identified already some of the main costs and frustrations, but I wanted to go to Julian Walker as well at the Associated British Ports to ask about that from a ports perspective, but also to ask all of you about SPS and whether a lot of the frustration sits in that area or whether it covers everything. Should we start with Julian?
So if I start, so just to give context, so ABP, we run 21 ports around the UK. So the key sort of entry point to and from the EU is through the Humber. So Dover's not one of our ports, so I can't comment on that. So initially, immediately post Brexit, there was that sort of period of time where there was a lack of clarity as to what was going to be the operating model, and the need to then have the infrastructure put in place was pretty disruptive. And
can you just elaborate on what that means?
Well, it was about understanding what infrastructure was required around the border control posts in particular. So there was a period of time where the government were running an exercise for providing some grant funding to that we had to apply for. We didn't know exactly what was the level of inspections that were going to happen. It's still not entirely clear as we move forward. But we, across ABP, had to put in 4 new border control posts, including Plymouth and up on the Humber, Southampton, which is operated by DP World, which does container terminals and most of rest of world stuff, and then 1 in Hull and 1 in Immingham. Investment-wise, we had to spend about 45 million building these very bespoke buildings. So, they're obviously they need to be designed for food grade, for deep frozen, for chilled, etc., etc. So they're not great for other uses. But we were supported with government funding just north of 30 million for that. But it was a competitive process. I think the overall request from ports was north of 300 million, 200 million coming from government. And as Portsmouth have an interesting sort of story to tell there. So the infrastructure is built. We have to go out and recruit all the people to operate these facilities. We're now in a pretty good place. I think it's pretty stable. But there is variability, whether it's AFA, Border Force, doing the inspections and customs. So we see a peaks and troughs in that. But the big thing is, we've got stability now. We feel from a port perspective on incoming traffic, average turnaround times of about an hour when AFA do an inspection, so that's doing a strip and then a reload. So pretty stable. There will be cases where, for a paperwork issue or poorly packed cargo, it takes longer. But I think we put a huge amount of effort in providing a service to, the haulage industry, because they are our indirect customers as such.
Can I just check, did you just absorb that £15 million net cost as an act of charity to the nation, or did you have to put prices up a bit?
Yeah, so what we're doing at the moment, we do charge for every piece of cargo that goes through, so we apply a £12.71 for every trailer going through to recover both the OPEX and the CAPEX cost.
Yeah. So you had to put that up, or is that the margin?
So we had to put that charge in place because it wasn't in place before.
The extra £12.
Exactly, for each unit.
But over what time period would you look to be recovering that? Because I mean, that's a relatively nominal cost, so that looks like a pretty long-term recovery.
It will continue in part because obviously there's the OPEX, the increase in labour costs associated with that, but then also you've got the maintenance on the facilities that goes up as they get older. There was a big debate amongst the port industry as just how you manage this in terms of splitting trailers out, because if they're going through an AFA inspection, they could be stripped entirely. And if you were trying to recover all the costs associated with both the CAPEX and the OPEX for just those trailers that were stripped out, it just wouldn't work, because it'd be thousands of pounds per trailer. So we as ABP elected to put a standard, relatively nominal charge in across the industry. So where we are at the moment, I think is we're in a pretty good place. It's pretty stable. Speaking to the team yesterday, but the big question is what happens with SPS if that comes in 2027? Could that create further challenges, because there'd be a significant uptick in the number of inspections that we required, and then potentially also the single trade window, where I think everybody, both the haulage industry and the port industry, would like to see minimal paperwork and a single platform for interfacing with the EU. But the critical thing is it needs to be consistent with what each of the countries within the EU want. So you're doing it once. So from a port perspective, we haven't seen a significant downturn in volume, certainly through the Humber. What we have seen is a change from accompanied to unaccompanied. So there's been a decline in the number of accompanied trailers going through the port, but actually that's been offset by an increase in unaccompanied.
So when you say companies, you're talking about just different organisations are now coming into trade?
Accompanied, so you literally have a driver with the unit as opposed to just a trailer that's taken onto a ship using essentially a tug and then taken off. So it is a different model. And if you look at the DFT stats for Dover, they have seen a significant decrease in the number of accompanied going through.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. These extra costs that you've had to charge, where do they end up? Do they basically end up on consumers?
Ultimately, I guess, we're charging, the importer, so it will feed through ultimately to the consumer.
Okay, Mr. Gunn, then, do you think you've shared all the principal frustrations that now bedevil your members?
Well, the principal frustration, certainly moving goods to the mainland Europe, would be around delays and paperwork. We have a specific concern around the introduction of the entry-exit system and the capacity constraints that'll put on our sector. You asked the question earlier to Toby, how are you still in business? The sad reality is in the last few years, a lot of haulage firms have gone out of business. We've seen insolvencies comparable to the levels of 2008 financial crisis, and margins margins down to about 1.5, 1.6% in 2024, from about 2%. We're a low margin sector, and competitive, and seek to be competitive to keep costs down for our customers. The challenge, I think, with SPS is that if it does do what it's supposed to do, make it easier to move, or easier for goods to move in theory to the European market, you will then need a road haulage sector in good health that's able to grow to meet that. And we do see additional restrictions, particularly on UK drivers being able to come in and do that work in the context of our sector getting smaller as a result of economic pressures and the burdens that we're discussing today.
Okay, thank you. Ben Aldridge.
Hello, well, thank you for coming. So the British Chamber of Commerce found that overall about 54% of UK exporters were dissatisfied with the trade and cooperation agreement, and 73% felt that they had little or no support in managing ongoing changes in the UK's trade policy. To what extent has the reset helped address any of the issues UK traders now face? Is there anything coming along that feels tangibly different?
From a port perspective, no. We haven't seen any material change.
Do you expect to see any material change from what you've seen?
No, but I think, and this is probably the second session when you talk about the ETS and further opportunities to have consistency with the EU in terms of regulatory systems, that will be really important.
My response to that, Mr. Aldridge, is that we're not the traders, we're the logistics providers, we're the service that gets those goods to move. It may work for traders, but it also needs to work for us, and there's not that much in the reset that's focused on the challenges for logistics. Obviously, we welcome that there is a reset aspiration. We welcome progress on SPS. That could create more work for our members and make our lives, Toby's lives, his ability to be, to run a competitive and profitable business a lot easier. But we do also need to see both the European Commission and the UK government understand that there are frictions that are borne, particularly within the logistics sector, costs that we can and do, where we can, pass on to our customers, some of which simply is absorbed by lower margins.
So do you recognise that I suppose criticism of support, the 73% of exporters feeling that they haven't got any support to manage these changes? Is that something that you would recognise from a logistics perspective as well?
We would do, and there are glimmers of light, specifically in the context of moving goods into Northern Ireland. There's been some good progress in terms of the Murphy review and the recommendations being agreed and accepted by the government from that, the move to a one-stop shop, more funding for Intertrade UK. But that's quite specific to moving goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. There's a head of steam up, hopefully, on revisiting some of that. That doesn't speak to the difficulties in moving goods into mainland Europe, and I don't know whether Toby would want to add to any of those points on that, since that is his business.
Yeah, as a haulier, I obviously have daily conversations with my customers, all exporting through the SPS channels, and there just seems to be, at the moment, it was fantastic hearing an announcement, and when we heard the announcement, it was like, how long is this going to take? And for us, that will be the light at the end of the tunnel when if we get a date, or if just simple things like making health certificates. The French saying, okay, we'll accept an electronic copy, an email with a stamp from a vet saying, okay, I've made a mistake, here's a letter correcting the mistake, you can release the truck, rather than turn the truck around in Calais and bring it back to the abattoir to get the new certification done and then send the truck back. We're all trying to cut our emissions, sending lorries all the way across the country just for a stamp on a piece of paper. It just doesn't make sense. And any steps positive steps we can take with the SPS agreement.
But we're 8 months into this so-called reset. Yeah. And it doesn't sound like you've been overwhelmed with progress.
We've, as hauliers, have seen no benefit from it.
Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Alastair, do you believe that any of your members have received any Brexit benefits at all?
That's a difficult question to ask. I haven't asked them all. The evidence is clear that goods movements are down. Our sector thrives on moving goods until you start to see a consistent uptick in goods. But I should preface this by saying that, for example, for roll-on, roll-off accompanied movements, the trend's been downward for about 25 years. So there are deeper issues than the 2016 vote, the terms of the TCA. We would hope that the reset or other initiatives can turn that around, but there is a sort of a longer-term decline within our sector that we need to get to the bottom of. The answer probably is no to your question.
You talk about the long-term decline. Do you think that Brexit and the issues and paperwork that has been caused as a result of it has exacerbated that long-term decline or sped it up, do you think?
It's quite clear that the volume of goods moving between the UK and Europe has fallen considerably since 2019, initially as a result of the COVID restrictions and then the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and there is no sustained increase in that subsequently. There have been years where things have got better, followed by difficult years, and for a sector it's become harder and harder, whether you're doing international work, going into Europe, getting goods to the ports for container work, or doing domestic haulage. It's a tough time for the sector. And it would be wonderful to be able to turn around and say that there was an upward turn ahead of us. At the moment, it's not clear what that is. We'd hope that the reset can deliver that.
Okay, I'm just slightly concerned about the joint statement that came out of the May 2025 summit, because it talked about, in quotes, mutual commitment to free, sustainable, fair and open trade. There wasn't any specific reference to customs easements, even though that is allowed for in the TCA. So given these reforms are perfectly possible, I mean, and given the costs that you've just described for us, why is government not going hell for leather to try and get these customs easements in place, in your view, Mr. Gunn?
I think that's a question you'd have to put to the government. I can't answer that question, I don't think.
Okay, but presumably you're knocking on their door all the time saying, come on, where are the customs easements, people?
We are knocking on the door any way that we can, including through your committee chair, for which we're grateful. We're getting fantastic support on some of these issues from the Department for Transport, and I should say getting good engagement now on the Northern Ireland piece through the Cabinet Office and HMRC. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure we've had much progress in some terms of some other departments being able to get this at the top of the ministerial in-tray. And we'd love to see...
Sorry to do this to you, but which are the departments that you would say put in the slow lane and which in the less slow lane? So DFT you've highlighted as a department that is helping you.
We have a superb relationship with DFT, but perhaps sometimes get seen as a DFT stakeholder when we're also representing a critical arm to not just the logistics sector, but all parts of UK PLC. Mm-hmm. Our engagement into the Home Office is improving, Cabinet Office is improving. I'd be interested to know the last time that someone from the RHA sat down with someone from DBT. I can't answer that question, and I'm sure that if they wanted to invite us in, we would accept the invitation.
Okay. I mean, Mr. Walker, are you just...
In terms
is your diary full of meetings with ministers asking for your help in getting customs
and in many areas as well, in terms of engagement? And obviously the port industry is more than just trade with the EU, and proportionally, significantly more trade comes from the rest of the world than through EU. So it is about consistency and frictionless trade is what we want to see. So that's very much the message we give in respect of the interface into the EU.
Okay, Mr. Cooper.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gunn, you mentioned Northern Ireland, and there are huge complexities there because of that land border with the EU, and the committee actually went over to Belfast and we had a look at some of the physical infrastructure there on the ground and got a sense of how difficult it is. So I just wonder what your sort of take on the situation is with Northern Ireland, and what areas have been particularly problematic. Cairn Ryan, the ferry port, is in my constituency in Dumfries and Galloway, and I hear a lot about difficulties with the just-in-time supply chain, particularly around fresh food.
I'll give you a case study. We very kindly were hosted in Parliament by Lord Murphy a few weeks back last month, and brought along a British business, great British business, based I think in the southeast. And they'd had, at that very moment, had to make the decision that one of their lorries in Cairn Ryan would have to be turned back because of an issue with the question of the country of origin status of a steel product that they weren't able to resolve. So that's a business sending a product all the way from southern England up to your constituency to get into Northern Ireland, finding a border friction, nothing to do with customs, and having to make the decision to send that all the way back to then sort out the problem. And one can only imagine the cost to that haulier, but also to the business that they were seeking to serve. I've visited hauliers in Northern Ireland who talk about, one of them estimated, we did a bit of a back of an envelope, £75,000 worth of costs just on driver time from delays that they get with goods being pulled. These are goods that aren't going on into the Republic of Ireland. These are goods that should be not at risk. They should be green-laned within the UK internal market system. I should say on top of that, they've also had to hire 2 people to deal with the customs and so forth paperwork. So for that haulier, a modestly sized haulier, the costs of doing business have gone up into the six figures, and that's in the context of the Windsor framework being in place. Also now with the import control system 2 coming in mandatory from earlier this month, reversing some of the progress that they saw from the Windsor framework on easing some of the data requirements. So it's very complicated, it's very costly, and also going in the wrong direction.
Right. Mr. Walker, would you recognise that picture?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to say that I can't really comment. So we don't have any ports that interface into Northern Ireland per se.
Okay. Fine. Mr. Rollins, you'd be the same. Do you export to Northern Ireland?
We export not huge amounts to Northern Ireland, but we actually find it easier to route the vehicles through Dublin, paperwork-wise, and then cross the border than it is to use the Northern Irish ports.
Right, so you're actually driving around the problem quite literally.
Yeah.
Okay. And back to you, Mr. Gunn, then you mentioned Lord Murphy. Obviously his recommendations about what we can do about the Windsor framework have been accepted in full by the government. That was only, I think, in September. How are things moving? You talked there at the end, you said things were going in the wrong direction. You're not impressed by what's changing?
The government accepted the Murphy report on, I think, the 22nd of December. I know because it coincided with our team Christmas lunch, but I was distracted from it. So that was quite recent, and as ever with these things, you judge what's delivered on it. I think we needed to see, what we wanted to see more from the government actually was on some of the specifics. We've been putting forward ideas like a trusted haulier scheme to match essentially the trusted trader scheme that you have for retail. But we didn't see any acknowledgement that that's a possible solution. And if it's not, we welcome the engagement to get into the detail and see if it's viable. We want to see, as an organisation, the determination of risk move to the point of sale, rather than dealing with all these things at the border. But we also need to see some of these complexities dealt with. Toby's not the only haulier who will tell you it is easier to move goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland via Dublin. It's easier. It's not a universal view, but for people who are doing that, they find that easier. And that is strange, that to go from whatever one's position is on the constitutional questions, which isn't ours, to go from the UK to the UK, it's best to go through an EU country in the context of how difficult it is to move goods into the European Union. That's still easier. That suggests that there's quite a radical solution required.
That's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Right, Sarah Edwards.
Thank you. With your permission, Chair, I'd just like to revisit something that was just mentioned.
I'm slightly against this.
That's okay, thank you. Alastair, I just wanted to come back to the point that you made that you represent road haulage across the whole of the United Kingdom, and they're responsible for moving goods across this country, import and export, and you're saying that you've not ever had a conversation in your memory with the Department of Business and Trade, who have regional teams that operate advice and support, or you haven't been invited to? I'm just a bit concerned that they're not engaging with you on this quite serious issue.
They've got trade in their name, you see, so we're just a bit concerned about
that. I should probably clarify, my role is new to reflect the complexities that the haulage sector is facing in trade. I've been in post for a small number of months, and there's a need for us to up our game and our engagement, but we've found some doors more open than others. Let me go back and give credit to where we've seen that. The Cabinet Office have ownership of the reset, have ownership to some extent of the Windsor framework, and we've, for example, we're now with the Northern Ireland Business Stakeholders Group, which we were not previously. So there is, I think, a growing understanding across government of the importance of logistics and of road haulage in particular. I'm sure someone from the RHA has met with that department. I just can't. It hasn't happened in my time yet, and I hope it happens soon.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
I think we're all quite interested in how do we move this situation into something that might hopefully work, because it's not sounding like it works. I mean, you've just described, Toby, 26 red stamps all over your paperwork. That seems distinctly analogue, and we should be moving, I would have hoped, to a digital world. So are there some things that we could be moving towards that you would welcome, that you've heard about, and what's that time frame looking like? And Alastair, might want to start with you because you might have some thoughts, and then please, if Julian and Toby, your thoughts as well.
Digitisation is potentially transformative, but only in potential terms. We haven't. Sometimes the costs of digitisation can get in the way as well. I know we've got concerns from some of our membership in Northern Ireland who are not hugely concerned about Windsor Framework per se, but use the Trader Support Service and that's now moved from Fujitsu to a new consortium of providers who I know have got some pretty exciting aspirations in the space, which is great, but they're worried about what the costs are going to be of transferring all their APIs to get that transferred over. There's great potential, but it does need to work throughout the system. And I'll defer actually to Toby, because I think we've in theory, the environmental health certificate has gone digital, hasn't it? But do you find that you're now doing trade in a more digital fashion as a result?
No, to be fair, like more paper than ever, really. And there just seems to be no sort of real consistency with it. And when you look at, for instance, just before Christmas, the BSE regulations in the UK were changed. So the vets in the UK were told to raise certificates in a certain way moving forwards, which they did. Vehicles then started arriving in Calais, and the French announced that they were being instructed to look at it in a different way, which made every health certificate in every vehicle which was heading for Calais essentially null and void. So we very quickly built up a large number of vehicles parked in Calais, not achieving a huge amount, and then stopped a lorry in Chippenham, where a vet then went and met the vehicle with a wad of health certificates like this and took to all the lorries in Calais, and then they were released.
Forgive me for asking this. Is this just the French?
So we don't. One of my major criticisms is that we can't import meat direct into Spain. There's ferry services from the UK direct into Spain, but all the meat we export to the EU, we have to go via France for the checks, essentially. Just before Christmas, we sent 20 lorry loads of lamb to Portugal. All of those had to go through Caen or Saint Malo, the ports in the north of France, and then drive all the way down. Before Brexit came along, we would have driven to Portsmouth and jumped on a ferry and jumped off of it in Santander, and the driver having a nice cruise along the way. But it is just, there's so much red tape legislation now involved. It's just not realistic sending the lorries into Spain because we can't clear the borders. There's no consistency across the EU with regards to the checks. We would sell lorries into Holland. For instance, we load beef out of an abattoir in Aberdeen every week, 2 or 3 times a week. To go into Holland, the logical step would be to go to Killingholme and sail into Rotterdam. We have to go via Calais because there's not the checking facilities in Rotterdam to be able to do it. The road miles, the driver fatigue, the emissions, just all through the roof. And it's just one massive step backwards.
Thank you. Yeah. And so, Julian, is there any solutions in other countries? Switzerland have a slightly different method. That's something that we could look at maybe adopting with some tweaks, I'm sure. But what's your experience? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Is there something that you'd like to quite, carbon copy?
Well, speaking just quickly from an AVP perspective, I think the key thing for us is making sure that we have a consistent sort of process going forward, so we don't have regular or too often having these changes coming through. And when things are implemented, whether it's a single trade window, SPS coming through, that they actually work, because otherwise that's where you get the blockages, the inefficiencies kick in, etc. I'm not an expert, I'm afraid, on sort of other interfaces, but having lived in Switzerland for a period of time, it was very inefficient going between France and going through the border at Geneva. There were checks obviously happening, but the vast majority of trucks were driving straight through.
Efficient or inefficient?
Efficient. So a small number of vehicles were checked, but it would be the 1 to 2 to 3% probably.
It's like targeted.
Exactly.
Yeah, rather than a blanket, everything we're going to check.
Rather than blanket, yeah.
That's very helpful.
Okay, right. Thank you very much indeed for painting that alarming picture, and thank you very much indeed for your views on how we might improve the situation. That has set the stage very nicely for the next couple of panels. That concludes this panel, however. Order.
Order. Welcome to the second panel in today's hearings on the Brexit reset with the European Union. Thank you very much indeed to our panel for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, would you just introduce yourself with a one-liner? Tom, do you want to start, please?
Tom Bradshaw, President of the National Farmers Union, representing 43,000 members across England and Wales.
Perfect, thank you. Peter?
Peter Brennan, Director Trade and Economic Policy at UK Steel, the trade association representing steel companies in the UK.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Matt Hinde, Head of International Policy and Engagement at National Grid.
Thank you, Matt.
And I'm Oriel Petry. I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs here in Airbus UK.
Great. Tom, let me just start with the question that I posed at the top of the first panel, which is whether you think that the trading relationship that we've got with the EU today is what people thought they were voting for. Because we've asked your sectors to come together, because when we look at just the cold numbers, we can see food and drink exports down by a quarter in 5 years. It looks like we're going to be paying £800 million into the EU in carbon tariffs if we don't join up the electricity trading systems. We're not in the defence partnership for SAFE, and we've got steel facing measures labelled as disastrous. So it just feels like actually it's quite a tough outlook for a number of sectors. But just describe what the relationship with the EU is like today for your members. Is it better or worse than it was 10 years ago?
So we've definitely seen increased friction at the border since withdrawal from the EU. We actually believe that there's over 35% fall in trade volume with the EU since 2019.
35%?
Yeah, and the premise that we work on behalf of members is that demand creates value, and if you're seeing the demand for the product fall, then obviously that's not the best opportunity to create the best return for the product members are producing. So there is opportunity from reducing the friction at the border. But we've also seen we are no longer fully aligned, and we've moved forward in certain technological areas. Gene editing is one of them. Plant protection products is another one where we are not currently aligned, and we do think we need to be able to take the opportunities that exist in those areas. Particularly, there is some real opportunities to become world leaders and drive inward investment in research and development in that particular area of gene editing, and we need to be able to seize that opportunity.
Okay, we're going to get into how we optimise that in a second. Peter, what's your perspective? What are your members facing now?
It's slightly different. I mean, steel is much more frictionless in terms of the way it moves around the world, and obviously there aren't the same problems with organic material. But the problem we really have is we're at a time period where the steel industry is fragmenting. There are a lot of trade barriers being put up everywhere because the continued overproduction in China seeps into the global markets and is distorting prices and making it basically unworkable for most of the developed world to continue making steel and other heavy industry. So our concerns is more that what's happening is trade barriers are going up. The US put up barriers, Canada, the EU is going to put up barriers. We have to put up our own. And unfortunately, one of the problems is that interrupts trade flow between the EU and UK. Simply as just because when you do these trade measures, they have to target everyone, and so there's collateral damage. So it's more of an issue of we're not in a giant trading bloc anymore, whereby we all have the same sort of rules and parameters. So we're a much smaller fish in a world where everyone's putting up barriers.
So your members, is the UK steel industry in a better position or a worse position than it was 10 years ago?
The industry is in a worse position than it was 10 years ago.
Right, okay. Matt Hinde, we obviously decoupled the electricity trading systems, not that was a big feature in the debates 10 years ago. And now that the EU has introduced CBAM, it looks like we might have to pay in something like 800 million in carbon tariffs if we don't get the systems joined together. But can you just paint us a picture of what your business is going through and others in your industry today?
Sure. So, and thanks very much for the invite to speak. So we run the major part of the electricity interconnector fleet with the EU, and electricity interconnection accounts for about 15% of the UK's energy mix. It provides flexibility and security of supply to the system, and it enables future UK energy exports. The consequence of leaving the internal energy market was, as you say, we decoupled from the highly efficient market coupling system in 2020. That reduces the efficiency of the operation of the interconnectors. That has a direct cost to UK consumers. It also makes the development of future infrastructure more complex and difficult. And there is a similar issue which really kicked in on the 1st of January 2026 with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will create a new and unnecessary trade barrier in the North Sea and the Irish Sea.
Right. So it sounds like you're in a worse position, not a better position.
It's certainly a more inefficient position.
Okay. Oriel, what's the situation for your firm and for your industry? Have you got a bunch of new freedoms now that mean that the business is in a stronger place?
So as you know, Airbus leads in civil aircraft globally, and what we do here in the UK is the wings manufacturing, and after our acquisition of Spirit and Belfast and Prestwick, we now employ 15,000 people. We are also the UK's biggest satellite manufacturer. In both those areas, I mean, as you know, defence has only recently come in within the sort of European arena, and in both those areas, we have invested over the last 10 years about 2 billion. The wings are manufactured here, and the satellite communications satellites are also made here. We have seen we have to obviously do more paperwork, as we've heard in the earlier session, and various areas such as product certification has also got more complicated. But the investment has continued, and the UK remains a key part of our global business.
Okay. Are you able to characterise the business as stronger for being in the constitutional position we're in at the moment, or overall?
In aerospace, we've been quite fortunate because we've had a WTO agreement on tariffs that has kept it steady. So we are in a similar position now as we were before. There is more paperwork that we need to do. I suppose from our point of view, the key point is that the UK needs to continue to partner with Europe, particularly in defence and particularly in space, where we see the need for greater consolidation with a market that, as has been said, is globally becoming more competitive. And it is critical, therefore, that the UK thinks about its capabilities and its sovereign capabilities in a broader European context. That remains a key priority for us.
That's really useful. Tony Abad.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm coming back to UK Steel, to Peter. What do you think the EU's impending steel measures are going to do to the UK steel sector?
Well, nothing good. So the problem here is that the world is waking up to the fact that China isn't going to stop producing steel. It's kind of export deflation around the world because it doesn't have the domestic demand. So it's going to have to keep exporting in massive quantities. So the US got the ball rolling with putting tariffs on everything. Other people are going an equally blunt route that the Europeans are saying we're going to just halve the existing quotas we have, which means everyone exports to them less. And then the UK is going to have to work out what it wants to do as well, and we need to do something similar. But the thing that we're trying to get across, and that we hope when it comes to a reset, if there really is a reset, is that the UK is not the problem when it comes to exporting steel to the EU. We are not the ones aggressively undercutting prices or anything like this. We have long-term relationships. And actually, in the last 10-year period that they're really looking at, where imports into the EU have risen quite sharply, UK exports to the EU have fallen in that time sharply. So we're not the problem. The problem is, unfortunately, that because these are blanket sweeping quotas, the UK get caught up in it. And because 78% of our exports go to the EU, it means we get hurt particularly hard.
And when the steel strategy comes, as we all hope it will do soon, what should it say on this matter to protect the UK steel industry? There
are two things. One, we have to be getting UK-specific allocations in the EU quotas, so we have them currently. We need to make sure that they aren't reduced by the same amount that other countries are. Obviously, there's a lot of WTO things at play here in terms of favoured nations and these sorts of things. But if there is this economic reset that the EU want with the UK and national security and these sorts of measures, we should be, getting something out of that. We also need the other side of that is the UK have to put in significantly tighter import quotas of our own. We currently have import quotas, but in over half the categories of steel, the actual quota is larger than UK demand, so offers zero protection. We need that to be considerably strengthened.
Okay. And would you like to comment on what your hopes are for UK CBAM and how steel producers are finding it in these first couple of days of having to negotiate EU CBAM?
Well, we need linkage. We need to link the emissions, and we need to get CBAM exemptions, and then it's a reasonably good thing. I don't know how close we are to doing that. That's something that, again, if there is reset talks, that's something we'd like accelerated. The problem is not just for the uncertainty is a massive problem for everyone exporting, but the sheer amount of paperwork for smaller companies in particular, it just makes it unworkable. And at the moment, the way that the EU has implemented the CBAM, it's very, very complicated. And lots of importers basically just got ahead of the curve, import as much as possible, because they don't want to work out the headaches.
Yes, me. I also wanted to ask about the rules of origin and the extent to which the steel industry may be affected by some of the increasing concerns around the world about exactly where products have come from. Do you have a comment on that, Peter?
Yeah, well, it depends. Obviously, the big concern there is Tata Steel, because obviously at the moment they're not melting steel. They're going to be importing the raw material while they're building electric arc furnaces. So hopefully we can get exemptions there with the EU, because we are doing the investment to decarbonise, which is one of the reasons that we're putting all these CBAM policies in place. With the US, in the end, that hasn't been too much of an issue. So the Tata Steel is able to export to the US under 25% tariffs. But we'll have to see in the wash how this comes out when the EU finalise what they want to do for import quotas.
Thank you.
Alison Griffiths, did you want to come in on this, Alison? Do you want to come in on steel? Anything further on steel?
No,
okay, thank you. Let me just check, Peter, my understanding of this. So the proposal before the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers doubles the tariff on steel imports over and above the quota limits from 25 to 50%. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And the quota for tariff-free EU steel falls by 47%.
Yeah, exactly. So they're looking at, they're trying to reduce the amount of imports that go into the market quite substantially. The EU, they used to be a massive net exporter of steel, so they've lost those markets largely. So that's significant volumes of steel that they would produce to a market they don't have anymore. They've also been losing domestic market share to imports, as well as having a constraint in terms of demand.
Okay, but if these measures are implemented, what is it going to do to the UK steel industry?
Well, it depends, but it will most likely reduce significantly our exports to the EU. So it's a big problem for specific sites which are very dependent on exports.
Can you forecast what the jobs impact of that would be?
No, it's not really my place to do that. It depends. I mean, it really depends on how the quotas are allocated. Because it's not just steel as steel, there's all these different categories, and how the allocations work within those, whether the UK get them, it's all up for grabs really in the negotiations.
Okay. And you're basically praying for a UK exemption from these measures?
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, what we want is allocations to be as high as possible, reflecting the traditional trade flow. If there are exemptions for products that we make that the EU doesn't make as well, that's great. I think the way that the EU is looking at it is probably they don't want to go down the exemption route, because traders find ways of doing kind of loopholes for bringing in stuff. So what we really want is allocations as high as possible, reflecting our historic trade routes.
Okay. Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. If I could come to you, excuse me, Ms Petry. Defence. In May last year, we agreed the Security and Defence Partnership with Europe, and there were great hopes that we would then be involved in SAFE, the Security Action for Europe loan scheme. But by December that had fallen through, and we seem to be a million miles apart. We were offering, I think, around about 200 million euros to enter, and I think Europe wanted something like 6.5 billion, so we're a long way apart. What is your view now of the situation? Can we turn this around? And what impact will this have on European security cooperation?
Yes. I mean, as a business, we were disappointed that the SAFE agreement was not reached. I think for us, the security and defence agreement that was reached in May is helpful, because it gives us access to 35% content on products that are bought with SAFE-backed loans. And for us as a business, that means that our large aircraft, A400M military aircraft, but also the Voyager, the MRTT, it can be financed by SAFE. So if another member state, Poland or somewhere else, would wish to buy our large aircraft, they can use a SAFE-backed fund.
That's a transport aircraft and an aircraft that's involved in refuelling, right?
So exactly. And the Security and Defence Pact in May gave us that 35%. But obviously that is not the same as being full members. And with all of this, clearly we have our priorities as a country, but of course the EU needs to meet them. So this is about the negotiation of finding, common ground. And it was disappointing that between that May agreement and then actually only having the Coreper agreement that was really quite late October time, where the member states said, yes, Commission, you can go and negotiate with the UK was left with quite a tight timescale for that negotiation. That is definitely a shame and not an ideal outcome. But as I say, what we got in May at least gives our business sufficient to be able to continue to export.
Have you any sense from the government of whether or not the negotiations continue? Was that a cliff edge in December, or are you aware that we're still trying to get into safe?
Yeah, only what's, I think, been said publicly. I think the Prime Minister said that he doesn't expect to open that negotiation again. I think that's my understanding, so nothing other than what's been said publicly.
It's quite a setback, really, isn't it, in terms of European cooperation?
Yes, I think it's a shame. But as I say, it's not a total bar. There is, through that pact, there is some access through SAFE. And I suppose the other thing I'd say is SAFE is just one part of what Europe is trying to do in terms of rearmament. For us, and I think for the sector in general, some of the bilateral agreements that the government has signed with Germany through the Trinity House and Kensington treaties, but also the French agreement and others are important, because actually those that are buying defence equipment is not the European Commission, it is actually the individual member states. So from our point of view, the government pursuing bilateral relationships and bilateral pacts as they are doing is another avenue for us to foster cooperation, and particularly in defence.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So it's widely acknowledged that there's three areas where we're going to need to develop some capabilities in Europe in order to just pick up the burden that the United States may not bear in the future. So strategic command, heavy lift, and space, and positioning, navigation, and timing. So it sounds like in heavy lift and in space, there is, in your view, good platforms for cooperation with European defence industry, or not as good as it could be?
So on heavy lift, the aircraft that we have, as I say, the Security and Defence Pact does give us, from the UK's point of view, the access to have the aircraft with its wings manufactured in the UK and with its engines manufactured in the UK below the threshold where SAFE would not be allowed to be used by a country to purchase. In space, it's a different issue. We have consistently been saying that we need one space prime in Europe, not three. And so last year, the three big space businesses in Europe, Thales, Leonardo and Airbus, decided to merge. That process is now going through the motions, and from our point of view, we believe strongly that both the UK's strength but also Europe's strength lies in that consolidated space industry. Clearly that needs to go through the Commission, needs to go through the CMA, and it needs to go through various other regulatory barriers. But that we see as a way through. The CMA and the Commission tests, I suppose, would have been won before, but our hope is that the decisions will be made with that big prize of European capability at the heart of the decision making.
Yeah, okay, a bit more optimistic. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Matt, I'm quite interested in the current challenges that we've got around the cost of energy in the UK at the moment. And so I wondered if you could sort of describe the current situation that we have, and whether or not you can help us to understand also the cost that we're currently having to pay on the basis that we left the internal electricity market that the EU currently operates, and whether or not the emissions trading scheme is also creating some additional costs. Are you able to give us some idea of what that's doing to our bills, and particularly how it might be impacting businesses?
Sure. So in terms of what happened, as I said, we left market coupling. Market coupling is a highly efficient form of electricity trading. And if you'll permit me just give a kind of basic description of it, it's effectively the difference of being in market coupling is a one-click kind of commodity buying system. So you put it into the algorithm at midday and you buy electricity, a transport route and the transport. Outside of that, effectively you're buying electricity, the transport route and the transport separately. That in itself is inefficient. So there is a cost to that. We estimate that since we left the internal market, it's probably about €1 billion.
What's €1 billion?
So that has been the reduced efficiency has led to a cost of €1 billion to the interconnector fleet, where we would have effectively opportunity cost in terms of having more efficient trading. We estimate by 2030 that would be around €350 million a year. By 2040, probably €550 million a year as the interconnector fleet expands and is used more. So that obviously has an impact on consumer costs. I think Energy UK in 2022 estimated that as about a 0.7% increase in the wholesale price of electricity. So that's a direct cost. There is also a separate issue here, which is about the development of future infrastructure in the North Sea. There are quite ambitious targets for the deployment of offshore wind and interconnected grids in the North Sea in the run-up to 2050, not being in the same regulatory and market system as our partners at the other end of the interconnectors makes that more complex, more difficult, and by extension more expensive. In terms of the ETS, it's slightly more difficult to work out exactly what the cost of that would be. But at the consultancy, AFRI did warn that it could cause major GB wind curtailment and the knock-on negative socio-economic impacts. And Energy UK estimated it would cost UK exporters about $2.2 billion over the period of this Parliament.
Thank you. And so, is there any inkling as to when we might be rejoining it? Have you heard anything on the grapevine about making sure that we can re-enter the electricity trading element?
So we saw the government, the joint government and European Commission document before Christmas, which set out a slightly more detailed negotiating or draft negotiating mandate. I think that will progress into formal negotiations once there is the European Council agree a mandate. I would expect that. I mean, it's very speculative, but I would expect that to take slightly longer than ETS linkage negotiations. But within the next couple of years would be possible with political will to do it.
So confident, but not anytime soon?
Yeah. I mean, as ever, negotiating with the EU is a complex process with 27 countries, the Commission and the Parliament.
But it's not a technical problem in the sense that we haven't disconnected the cables. It's a legal and commercial and contractual problem.
Yes, which I think in themselves are quite technically not problematic, but technically complex. But yes, we still have the interconnectors in place, and they are working very effectively. It's just they're working less efficiently than they would within the market coupling system.
And the result is electricity prices are higher in this country.
Yes.
All right. Dan Aldridge.
Matt, I'm coming to you again. We talk a lot as policymakers about digital transformation, the power of digital and the power of AI to maybe transform some of our the way we live in a positive way, hopefully. If we look at the UK government's AI opportunities plan, what is your assessment of National Grid's progress towards its obligations under that? And also, is there any scope within the conversations for around EU UK reset to influence that, impact that in any positive way? And then follow on from that, are there any challenges in that moving that forward? What would you think?
I'm afraid that's not quite. That's rather beyond my area of expertise. I'm afraid on that.
Would National Grid be able to get us some?
I can certainly write to the committee with.
That'd be really
details
helpful.
On.
Thank you.
Charlie Maynard.
Thank you. A question for you, Tom. So does the government have the right approach on SPS, and what benefits will dynamic alignment bring? And I'm really asking, particularly in reference to, as I understand it, the Director of Travel is a proposed UK-EU common SPS area, but also kind of what your thoughts are about a common UK-EU customs zone, and where you've got customs aligned as well as beyond that SPS. Would those be good news for your members, or not so much?
I mean, we didn't initially support full dynamic alignment. We were looking for sort of an equivalence or mutual recognition, given that we were starting, or we'd had the same starting point and standards were pretty similar. But dynamic alignment is what the framework sets out in May, and that is the approach that's being taken. Reducing friction at the border is definitely in everybody's interest. And our horticultural businesses that are importing a lot of plant material have real concerns about the ability to import and the cost of that import, and then the risks associated with border checks taking place in the wrong place. So they would like that friction freed up very quickly. Our exporters, if we look at something like our beef exports, are down over 20% to the EU. Our dairy exports are down 16%. So again, that there is opportunity. I mean, not at the time of massive oversupply that we've got in dairy at the moment. I should just frame that. But longer term, there are opportunities there. Where I think the regulatory autonomy piece is something which is incredibly important. We have taken steps, particularly around plant protection products, but also around gene editing. We are no longer fully aligned. Those, with our climatic conditions here, mycotoxins is another issue where the EU have changed mycotoxin limits within, particularly within oats. We could have challenges meeting their mycotoxin levels. So we need technical solutions. Sometimes it's going to be a transitional arrangement, particularly plant protection products. We have 4 products registered that they do not have access to in the EU. We believe they will want to register those products, but we don't believe we can afford to give up the access to those products and have an interim period of stagnation.
But just on that, Tom, just in terms of, is there just a trade-off here? In terms of, it's like, I understand, we'd really like this bit or really like that bit, and it's very important for the oat sector to have this, but the EU is probably not going to be thinking in that level of granularity, given the kind of super tanker it is. We've got things like, the UK-EU common SPS area, we've got a UK-EU customs zone, we've got a single trade window, we've got aligning that whole digital infrastructure together as much as possible. Those all reduce frictions. Having the little kind of tweaks around this or this, is it just like, look, I totally follow that logic, but is it just like actually net, your sector is better off?
No, I don't think it is net. No, I think that there's a real danger here. And the crop that is in the ground that our members have already planted will have been treated with plant protection products that are not registered in the EU. That crop does not leave the store, all of it, until after the potential hard realignment date of June 2027. There will be fungicides being used in April, May and June this year on that same crop. So there are some really difficult issues that need solutions to them. And I don't think it is as simple as saying, there's a bit of give and you're going to end up in a better position. With gene editing, we can be world leading if we get a carve-out for gene editing. We can drive inward investment into the research.
Switzerland has got a carve-out for gene editing, yes?
That's something I'd need to get back to you on, where they...
That'd be helpful. What Mr. Maynard's obviously pushing you on is to help us understand the trade-off. So we've obviously heard about the collateral damage of current arrangements, and you've sketched out the prize of some carve-outs on gene editing and other things. But to the EU, that will look like cherry picking. It may not be a deal that can land. But just give us a sense of where you think the landing zone for a deal is that preserves the advantages that you want, but allows us to deal with this crazy red tape that we've heard about today.
But I think that it's in the EU's interest for us to have a gene editing carve-out. They want to adopt the technology, but they're behind us. We all know that things can take 10 years in the EU if there isn't anything to actually create momentum. If we get a carve-out, they will move much more quickly, and they will probably adopt the technology in 2 to 3 years. If we put the handbrake on, we may be still talking about this in 7, 8, 10 years' time, and nobody have benefited from the technology. So I think there is real merit in actually keeping the foot on the accelerator and putting the pressure on the EU to adopt where they want to technologically align. The same with plant protection products. They have a registration system in the EU not working at the moment. And we are going to rejoin that registration system. And if we're not very careful, we'll end up with a registration system for plant protection products that simply doesn't function properly. That is not in this country's interest, to end up stifling development and trying to produce safe, affordable food for the country. So I think there are some wins here that we've got to push pretty hard in our negotiating mandate to say this is worth us sticking out for some give from the EU and not sort of rolling over at the first opportunity. So I think that they would be 2 areas where we need to be pretty robust in saying, no, we need carve-outs and we need transition for those 2 particular areas. And that lost trade of 34%, just because suddenly we reduce friction, it's not going to come back the following year, is it? It's going to be hard fought to build back that trade because they've replaced it from somewhere else. So we can't go into this on the assumption that just because we've reduced friction, that trade is automatically going to come back. it's going to be, it's going to take time and people on the ground to get that trade back.
Point well made. Anything further, Mr.
Mayor? I think that's fine.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. Slightly conscious of time, but to address the issues that each of you currently face in either your organisations or sectors, what are your preferred options for making improvements to the UK-EU relationship? And perhaps if I start with Oriel and we work through, but as I say, if we can just keep it brief and focused as we go, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, in addition to what I said earlier, I think one of the key things for us would be the recognition of certification. So we've got a great example at the moment, well, not great, but a clear example at the moment where we're trying to sell some helicopters, and the pilots at the moment would need to have exactly the same training certified by the Civil Aviation Authority as well as EASA. So there's a classic example of where you could easily, if there were recognition that the training is the same, that there should be a recognition between the two. And so I think there is opportunity where our alignment is in fact still there to recognise that alignment. I think that would really, really help. And then some of the things that we've heard before, from our point of view, clearly and you had some great illustrations in the earlier session around customs forms again. Our products have not changed actually since before we left. So, getting an agreement on the fact that these are the same products that don't need what we've got at the moment from 15 to 54 different bits filled in, that would be great. And then, as you'd expect from me before...
Sorry, are you saying you've got 54 different bits of paper to now fill in?
Just for, in general,
yeah.
Where we had to fill in 15 before, we're now filling in 55. 54 bits of information just because of some of the things that were identified. And even one tiny wing part can require 4 forms in a way that's, or 4 bits of information that it didn't require before, even though, of course, the product hasn't changed. So I think that there is opportunity there at a very practical, technical level to make it easier. And then you'd expect me to say this, for us it remains not straightforward to move people around, and particularly short-term working parties where we're actually not challenging, for instance, employment in Hamburg. We just need to backfill, particularly at the at moments of pressure. That would be another one that, of course, would be key from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. I think I'd flag 3 things. One is an agreement on emissions trading linkage as soon as possible. Secondly, a targeted and relevant participation in the internal electricity market, and the draft negotiating mandate makes it clear that this should be about the rules that are relevant to cross-border electricity trading and those associated issues. And then finally, I think there's something interesting within that draft mandate about early engagement of the UK within the development of policy. I think it's clear in terms of the development of EU policy, the sooner you're in the discussion, the more opportunity you have to influence. And that's, in advance of voting or anything like that. And the draft negotiating mandate makes clear that there would be the potential for the UK to rejoin some of the bodies there, perhaps as an observer, but also to have a right to engage early with the development of that policy, and that would be very positive.
Thank you. Peter Steele.
Well, I would share the observation on mutual exemptions to linkages, and we need mutual exemption to CBAM, and that would work both towards working as a trade policy but being more effective in terms of carbon leakage, and directing the entire world towards a kind of more climate-friendly kind of outlook. And then the other point is quotas. We share a problem. We're both going to put in import quotas. It should be, beyond the wit of man to recognise that we're better off if we give each other favourable terms and conditions in our trade measures.
Thank you. And finally, Tom.
I think the only thing that I haven't raised, but I would completely agree with what Matt said, is we've got to make sure that we're involved in the decision-shaping process. That influence is absolutely paramount, and making sure we put our best people over there to influence the policy as it's being developed is going to be essential.
At the moment?
Well, we removed out of it for a very good reason, that we haven't had an ability to influence, and so we're going to have to re-engage in a way which we used to do, and we used to be very well respected for the role that we played in bringing a science and evidence-based opinion to policy development. But it doesn't come for nothing. We know we're going to have to really invest in the people to create the influence on the ground, to make sure that we aren't just a policy taker and that we can genuinely influence the policy without a vote.
Really useful. Okay, final question, just really quickly. We're 8 months into the reset. Has it made any tangible difference for you and your members today, Tom?
I don't think we could point to anything that's tangible yet, no.
Peter?
Some small changes around quotas, but nothing dramatic. And the beginnings of talking around linkages, but again, nothing final.
There has been an improvement in terms of the atmospherics, both certainly at a political level, but also to an extent at a working level, and that means we have had an improved access to some forums for the development of policy.
Is that a bottom line impact?
Not yet.
Okay. Oriel?
Yeah, I would end on a slightly more upbeat note.
Good, thank you, because it's been a world of pain so far.
Well, but honestly, this point around politics should not be taken too lightly. Clearly, for a business like ours, we would like more. But I think, as I said earlier, the pact that we've got gives us some access to safe-backed loans. The bilateral agreements really help when it comes to defence and aerospace. And I think the conversations that need to be had need to be founded on those kinds of that kind of attitude from the UK government.
Very useful. That's been incredibly helpful. Thank you very much indeed. As you know, the committee is visiting Brussels very soon, and you have equipped us with much to talk about. That concludes this panel. Order, order. Order, order. Welcome to this final panel in today's hearings on the reset with the European Union ahead of the committee's visits to Brussels. Paul Novak, General Secretary of the TUC, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for being flexible and moving your diary around so that you could be with us today. And Sean Maguire, thank you very much indeed for joining us too. Paul, perhaps I could start with you. So this is the 10th anniversary of the Brexit referendum. We're 8 months into the reset. I guess my question is whether you think Brexit has delivered what you think people voted for. Because we've heard, frankly, a world of pain from our witnesses today. I'm looking at numbers from the trade deals that we've signed over the last 10 years. Those trade deals give us an estimated increase in GDP of about 14.5 billion. But we think the economic cost of Brexit is about 240 billion. Mm-hmm. We know that we're losing something like 250 million a day in tax revenues. You know, exports to the EU are down. We've heard traders are filling in 1 million forms every 9 days. We've got red tape costs at £8.5 billion. Price is higher. Steel facing disastrous tariffs. I don't think people voted for this, did they?
I don't think they voted for economic self-harm, no. And listen, I can't speak on behalf of all of the British public because people voted for Brexit or for Remain for very different reasons. But I think what is without a shadow of a doubt is that the Brexit deal that we've got at the moment is a bad deal for Britain, and it's bad for our economy, and it's bad for the working people that we represent. For those people who are working in firms who are directly impacted by some of the things that you've talked about, Chair, in terms of increased costs for businesses, increased form filling, more friction in supply chains, but actually a bad deal for our members right across the public and private sector. I mean, the Bank of England has estimated what the GDP hit is something like 6 to 8%. That has a direct impact on the money that's available to spend on our NHS and our schools and our other key public services. So I think, you know, it's been a bad deal for Britain, and if you think about the decline in trade, added costs, decline in investment, it's one that I think the reset starts to put right, but we're still not in a place where the British public would want to be, and certainly we're not where unions want to be.
So for the members in the trade unions that you bring together, what is the day-to-day material impact of a deal that is far less than perfect?
Well, it's going to look different in different sectors, but I sat in on the session that you've just had with representatives from Airbus, from Steel. I mean, I spent a little bit of time at the end of last year in one of our large automotive employers, one of our steel employers, and they both talked about the concerns they had about Brexit directly on their business. You heard about the potential sort of impact on steel with increased tariffs, reduced quotas. But anywhere where you introduce additional costs for employers has an impact, not only on the day-to-day sort of running of that business, but decisions, long-term investment decisions as well. So there'll be some members who are very acutely impacted. I mean, Stellantis in Luton closed down with the loss of 1,000 jobs. Brexit wasn't the only reason. There are, you know, company strategic decisions that were made, things like energy costs. But without doubt, Brexit makes Britain a less attractive place to invest, or the type of Brexit deal that we've got now makes Britain a less attractive place to invest. But as I say, there'll be impacts felt right across, you know, including our members in public services, because of the impact of Brexit on funding for those services.
Has the TUC done work on the day-to-day impact on living costs and affordability?
Well, and without doubt, I mean, just to over the Christmas, we surveyed our members about, you know, sort of how they're feeling about the economy, and 4 out of 5 of workers generally feel that their economic circumstances are either stagnating or getting worse. 1 in 3 people who responded to our poll said that they were afraid to turn on the heating because of heating costs, and you heard before about the impact of Brexit on domestic energy costs. 1 in 5 said they're skipping meals because they're worried about making ends meet. Now, anybody who goes into a supermarket, and obviously we're not, you know, the newspaper headlines aren't dominated by the cost of living crisis and double-digit inflation in the way they were 12 months ago, 18 months ago, but our members are still feeling that impact in supermarkets where you go in. We know food inflation has been higher than core inflation, at a time where we've only just started to see wages rise in real terms after a thick end of 14 or 15 years of effective wage stagnation. So those cost of living pressures are real. I wouldn't pretend for one moment that they're all due to Brexit or the type of Brexit deal that we've got. There are a whole range of other issues as well, but no doubt they've added to those energy costs. They've added to things like the cost of the weekly shop.
Thank you. Sean, I was in a meeting before Christmas when somebody very senior in the CBI said that in his language there was a code red in the relationship between the UK and the EU. Tell us about the impact of today's deal on your members and what they're telling you about how well things are going.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think you mentioned it's 10 years since the referendum, and you know, we moved from frictionless trade to friction trade, even though the TCA is zero tariff, zero quota. Much of the concern that our members share with us isn't necessarily about tariffs, although we can come on to that, about steel. It is about the regulation and the regulatory divergence and lack of regulatory cooperation between the UK and the EU. And you will have heard from previous panels where they said even if our rules are identical, we have to conform with the EU and prove that the rules are identical or our standards are identical, and therefore that requires additional paperwork. So we represent all sectors bar fisheries. So if you multiply that across the whole economy, there is certainly a view that the Brexit deal that we have is better than a no deal, which was advocated at the time, and moving to a WTO situation. But even within the TCA, there are many limitations. But I should also say that while we have the TCA, it is the groundwork for better cooperation going forward. And one of the things that I would pick out is that while it has been in force since 2021, the TCA is not operating at its maximum either. It is not functioning at its maximum capacity. You heard in the first session about lack of uniform application of the rules, lack of transparency, 27 member states taking slightly different approaches on customs. So the fault isn't just at the door of the UK. There is quite a significant piece of work that Brussels needs to do and member states need to do to fully implement the trade agreement. And, that was perhaps some of the irritation that I think it was our chair said at the time in that meeting, but also the disappointment that SAFE fell through. And yes, Airbus representative did mention we can still operate on defence at a 35% capacity, our content capacity. But what could have been on the table could have been 60, 70%, which would have helped not just the larger defence companies, but also those within the ecosystem, defence ecosystem.
Game changer.
So much wider.
Well, let's get into some of the options for reform then. Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Chair. Within the UK's red lines that we've set out, what tangible improvements can you see us having realistically? And can you touch on some of the sort of high regulated sectors like electronics and pharmaceuticals? Sean first, please.
In what way, sorry?
What do you see, tangible improvements do you think we can have in the current rules that we already have, and how can we maximise them?
We've been very clear that, and certainly the Prime Minister set out that customs union, single market and free movement are off the table. One of the big benefits that we can have in this area is more regulatory cooperation. We need more dialogue between regulators so that they understand where both sides are going in their regulatory trajectory. And having some conversations and mechanisms for that regulatory cooperation will be important. In terms of the reset, the areas where I think are up for certainly improvement, as we said, on SPS, ETS, but one area where I think, and I would want to mention it here, where we are a little bit disappointed in the reset and indeed in the common understanding, is around mobility, and particularly business travel. And this underpins investment decisions across the board, not just in the UK, but also in the EU, getting people in and out of each other's jurisdictions at short notice, visa-free. I think that is the important element. And only with more improvements on business travel, reduction in the red tape on visas, the costs, can we see the real benefits for some of those sectors, particularly pharmaceuticals, advanced manufacturing, because whether it's perception over reality, when a company in the UK goes to its European board, whether it's in Bavaria, whether it's in Toulouse, and said, invest in the UK, the trigger that is in the mind of the board is, it's hard to get my people in and out of there. And that is a draw on investment.
I'd like to add something, Paul.
Yeah. Maybe to take it in three stages if I can. First of all, I think it's really important that the government secures agreement on the commitments that were made in that EU-UK reset as soon as possible. So a lot of talk about the SPS agreements, important in terms of UK farmers being able to export into Europe, but important for those prices in the supermarkets as well. 2/3 of our food imports come from the European Union, and when people are going through customs checks and those standards checks, it's definitely a barrier. Obviously, we've talked about steel and reaching agreement on steel, but getting agreement on CBAM and access, exempting UK businesses, finding ways around EU carbon taxes, really important. And then I know the government is committed to this, removing barriers for young people in the UK to go and live and work in Europe and vice versa. I think we'd like to see the government go further than the understandings they've already reached. And, so Sean's talked about chemicals and pharmaceuticals. We've got a particular set of concerns, for example, for people in the creative industries about seeing barriers for touring artists being removed. And then crucially from a trade union perspective, making sure that we strengthen the level playing field commitments between the UK and the EU on things like workers' rights. Now, the UK took a really important step forward with the passing of the Employment Rights Bill at the end of last year, but we are very keen for there to be sort of dynamic alignment between the EU and the UK on employment rights. Maybe just finish that. We think there's scope for the government to maybe think beyond its red lines. Now, the Prime Minister's been very clear. I'm not wedded, and the TUC certainly isn't wedded to things like a customs union. But I do think that we want to see the most positive, closest economic relationship that we can have with Europe as part of a broader political relationship with Europe. And actually, the events on the other side of the Atlantic over the last 12 months point to the need for us to have a good relationship with our largest trading partner. So, as somebody who sort of been involved in lots of negotiations, albeit different types of negotiations, I'm always a little bit wary about public red lines, and you sometimes need a little bit of flex. But I think we should be focused on outcomes, and we want what's best for British businesses, British workers, and British consumers. So I think it's really important that we just develop the strongest possible relationship we can with Europe. I think the reset gives us a good starting point, but there's much more to do.
Mr. Maynard?
Yeah, Paul, I mean, what you said over the Christmas period I thought was really useful, and as you expanded just now, so, you know, customs, or things that help the UK do better and help people do better in the UK. I completely agree. Keir Starmer responded perhaps to your comments saying, well, actually, customs union, not so much, maybe single market. And inside that kind of concept of doing better for the UK, services, goods, capital, in terms of being inside those markets, so those things that you instinctively are like, yes, and then of course then there's labour. What are your thoughts on those four?
Yeah, well, I say I want the closest possible relationship. I don't think that the British public is currently talking about a return to full mobility right across the European Union. But I do think that the sort of business travel that Sean talked about, those opportunities for young people that I talked about earlier, are definitely things that the British public would support. And they do want to see that closest possible relationship. I mean, the chair mentioned before about the relative value of the different trade agreements that the UK struck after Brexit. And I was part of the previous government's strategic trade advisory group, and sometimes it felt like, trade agreements it was pile them high, sell them cheap. I mean, they had very little value to the UK economy. And of course, UK is now part of CPTPP, for example, and you would want to take, we had some concerns about what that means in terms of countries like Vietnam that don't have independent trade union movements and respect for workers' rights and so on. But Europe is our largest trading partner. This is our most important economic relationship. And I think, economically it's important, but I go back to the point, Chair, as well. I think politically as well. We're living in an increasingly volatile and, let's be honest, dangerous world. Safe is an important part of the defence landscape in Europe, but it's not the whole picture when it comes to defence, and I think those close relationships are absolutely vital.
If we had goods, capital, services and labour was a separate conversation, I'm not saying it takes two to tango, I get that, but if that would be something instinctively you'd be like, well, that sounds good because it worked before.
Yeah, well, I haven't got one model in mind. I just think that you need to be fixed on what's going to deliver the best outcome for the British people.
Okay, thank you. Eric Edwards, do you want to just pursue that point?
And continue into the questioning.
Yes, please.
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Chair. So we've heard just now about this issue around there's a lot of red tape, quite a number of red stamps. We've now got red lines and negotiations, and we have a patchwork of product regulations and requirements that, quite frankly, we need to somehow smooth out. So some thoughts, we've got conformity assessments being called for by Make UK and the British Chamber of Commerce. And there is some talk about this Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention on Rules of Origin, also known as PEN, which basically harmonise the trading rules. So we've got some potential options, but it doesn't sound like the EU is particularly keen on some of those. So have you got thoughts on that or alternatives that you'd like to see? What are the options that we have for closer alignment?
Well, thank you. I should say at the outset we are a member of a European body called Business Europe, which represents 42 federations from 36 countries, so much wider than the EU. And before the summit, our CEO and the DG of Business Europe issued a joint op-ed in the FT, which addressed many of these issues, including CBAM, mobility, and regulatory cooperation. So the European and UK business community are aligned in the need to reduce the frictions and the cost of doing business, because it is harming both of us at a time, as Paul mentioned, when the whole global order is on its head. You know, Europe is chasing competitiveness and growth. The UK is chasing competitiveness and growth. And a divided continent is not in our interest. So, you know, from a business perspective. But there is politics here. And, you know, to refer to a previous question, it does take two to tango. And red lines on a UK side put red lines on an EU side as well, because we've heard it all before: cherry picking, can't have your cake and eat it, cakeism. I've heard them all. So we need to look at what can we do bottom up and build up. Now, the reset is a starting point, and again, we shouldn't underestimate the atmospherics and the fact that they're talking. That is important. Getting quick delivery on ETS linkage, CBAM, and SPS and alignment should create the trust that we can go much further and faster, that we're trusted partners on a whole range of areas. I mentioned chemicals and REACH. There are many other areas where we could dynamically align, where it is in the UK's national interest to dynamically align. So I think that is the starting point. With regards to PEM, everyone became an expert in PEM overnight. It is a complex convention in its own right, and it does solve some of the problems for some of our companies in the UK if your supply chains are part of the PEM convention countries. So it doesn't solve all problems, but it is another tool in the arsenal that can help reduce the burdens or the restrictions on rules of origin and the access to supply chains. So these are all potentials, but they're no knight in shining armour that is just going to resolve all of the problems. We are a third country, and certainly listening to the previous panel discussion around steel, we think we're like-minded with the EU. We are. We're a close neighbour. Yes. We share a lot of principles. Yes. But under global trading rules, we are a third country, the same as China. And we have to be alive to that, unless we move to other models, which I don't have a mandate as the CBI to go in on today. We've kicked the tires on all of these in referendum run-ups of Switzerland, Customs Union, Turkey model. All have their advantages. All of them have their drawbacks as well. So there is no silver bullet here, but there is a building mechanism with the reset to go much further, to go that extra mile. We've done this. It's worked well. Let's move forward.
Thank you. Paul, have you got anything?
Normally when I hear people rail against red tape, I roll my eyes because it just means what we want to do is deregulation. But there is a very real set of issues here. I mean, what those customs declarations are costing annually British businesses something like £7.5 billion a year. That's a problem. So action in that area. I think we would be supportive of the position taken by Make UK and the Chambers of Commerce on conformity assessments. We'd be supportive of mutual recognition of professional qualifications. I correct Sean, not everybody became an expert on PEM. Me most in particular. It's something the TUC hasn't got a position on, but we are looking. We think that it could be modest, but in some sectors it could have an impact. I suppose you raised an important question about what's the appetite like on the other side of the channel. And I think if we're all honest, a Labour government elected with a huge majority just in a July before last, you could see on the other side of the channel people think, well, this is who we're going to be doing business with over the next 10 years. Our politics is incredibly volatile, and I think if I was on the other side of the channel and looking at the prospect of Nigel Farage leading in the polls, I'd be like, this is a difficult enough relationship to navigate at the moment without the added sort of political complexity thrown up by that. I actually think one way of giving real assurance to partners on both sides of the channel is using the existing social partnership framework. So Sean, for example, is the vice chair of the Domestic Advisory Group that brings together the TUC unions, employers, civil society organisations here in the UK, but also in Europe, to provide advice, commentary on the application of the TCA, and to talk to the government about what more can be done. We, for example, have got a joint statement with our European counterparts about what's good for European workers and what's good for British workers, and things like dynamic alignment on employment rights is something that we support. And increased labour mobility is something that's supported on both sides of the channel. Opportunities for young people. So using those non-governmental avenues, I think, is also important, because this is about winning hearts and minds, and you need to demonstrate to businesses, to trade unions and the people we represent in workplaces, and to consumers, that this isn't about just political stitch-ups. This is about what is good for people on both sides of the channel.
Thank you. Mr. Mathers, did you want to comment?
Thank you. I just want to delve a little deeper into the rules of origin in particular, and automotive, because you may be aware that the temporary arrangements come to an end at the start of next year, and my understanding is that in particular, in terms of EV batteries, is going to be hugely problematic. If those rules come in as they currently intend to, what do you think that will mean for actually both sides of the divide?
Well, thank you. You are correct. It was extended until 2027. Last minute deal over 12 months ago. It was a stay of execution. We firmly believe that they need to revisit this, because if the EU is serious about meeting its emissions targets, and indeed the UK is serious about meeting its emission targets, then we need collaboration in this area. And this is a potential win-win for both economies. But I want to this is the appropriate moment to introduce the kind of conversations that are happening in Brussels and in member states in response to the change of the global order post Trump's introduction of tariffs. The EU is looking, how does it deal with a very aggressive China and a more unpredictable US? And has become much more inward-looking in its thoughts, and has become much more protectionist in this past 12 months than it has ever been. And language which would have been used 10 years ago by certain nationalities in a minority has become almost the language of Brussels, and that is European preference, made in Europe, which really means made in the EU. And we will see at the end of this month a new proposal from the Commission, which will have these European preferences littered through it. So while we talk about batteries and net zero and rules of origin, there is a bigger game in town now that this government needs to be alive to. All the wonderful things that are come out of the common understanding on ETS, on SPS, on Erasmus, could mean very little if the EU pursue a much more protectionist approach, which is inward-looking and 27.
But this could be an opportunity. I mean, if we decided to align on Resource EU or anti-coercion instruments or supply chain security or critical minerals integrity, I mean, actually, we could construct something like an economic security union, which would actually be a win-win for the European Union if they're worried about, the 15th five-year plan from China, which is imminent, and whatever is going to happen in the White House next week.
That, in theory, is yes, but actually, when you go to particular pieces of legislation that is going to be renewed, particularly around public procurement, it is very clear that it is in EU 27. It's not, so we could have all these things, but that is the bigger threat. And while rules of origin, where we would want an extension, if the EU is serious about this approach and doesn't think of including the UK within that ecosystem, there is a big challenge for growth for both of us. And it's not in any sector's interest to have a division between EU27 and the UK because our supply chains are so intertwined.
I mean, you raised a specific point about automotive, and I know you will know, Justin, more so than me, that this is a specific concern that Unite has about the UK automotive industry, partly because where we are producing EVs in the UK, quite often they're dependent on Chinese batteries at the moment. Now, obviously, we want to build domestic capability and capacity around batteries, but that's where we are at the moment. Obviously, a customs union or a former customs union would remove those issues around rule of origin. As I say, I'm not particularly wedded to one particular sort of model, and I think actually the UK is important enough and significant enough in terms of our economic footprint that you would want something bespoke. But it's certainly a concern that our unions have relayed to us.
Yeah. And do you, just on both of you, do you get a sense from this government that there's any sense of urgency, the imperative to sort this out, because obviously investment decisions are taking over much longer time frames than we're talking about?
I would hope that there is, and the UK automotive industry is an incredibly important employer in this country, not just in terms of those who are directly employed in the industry, but in terms of supply chains as well. And you know, we want to be at the cutting edge of EV battery technology and EV technology more broadly. But yeah, I would hope the government sees the urgency. I know, for example, they do definitely see the urgency around the issues that we talked about earlier, or you talked about earlier, in relation to steel. Again, I wouldn't want to claim that all of the issues facing the UK steel industry link back to the EU, because there are other issues, including the cost of industrial energy, the ownership of UK steel companies, some of the strategic decisions taken by those owners, but those tariffs would pose, I think, community union have described it as an existential threat to steel, and I take that seriously.
Okay, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, you mentioned mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And the Law Society of England and Wales couldn't be clearer that the government dropped the ball on this. They said that the government did not deliver on its manifesto commitment to improve MRPQ provisions in the services sector. Nothing seems to have happened this year of any great meaning. What are we going to do about this? The TCA arrangements at the moment seem not fit for purpose. Is this something that needs to be revisited urgently for the services sector?
Yeah, and we're very clear that we do want to see mutual recognition of those professional qualifications, and you know, whether it's lawyers or indeed, for example, professionals in education, in health. The thought of having to deal with 27 different regulatory regimes if you want to live and work abroad would fill anybody with dread. I mean, I think we are very keen for the government to reach a mutual agreement with the EU, and also to combine that with some of the stuff that I talked about earlier in terms of increased mobility provision, so it's easier for people to travel and to work, particularly in short-term business needs in the EU as well. We've already talked about increased youth mobility, and again, that's something that we'd be very supportive of.
Sean, you were nodding there. So
yeah, well, I think we need to be clear here, because I think sometimes it can be too easy to point the finger of blame at one side or the other, and maybe I will point the finger of blame, but it isn't at the UK on this occasion. We have seen certainly a proposal put forward on architects, and the EU voted it down because we required an additional test after Grenfell disaster that architects would undertake. It was seen as imbalanced, even though the two bodies in the EU and the UK said it was fair. I would go I will go on record to say that the EU are lukewarm, if that is even the temperature that they are, to mutual recognition of professional qualifications. They are also lukewarm to mutual recognition of conformity assessment. They say that this is a UK demand. Well, actually, we have admitted very clear that this is an EU business and UK interest to move forward in some of these areas. So I think this is where I would slightly take an issue that it is UK's fault. It's actually, well, it takes two to tango, but actually the EU has been very, very lukewarm in it raising up the mutual recognition. And as you will see in the common understanding, there is, I think, a sentence on mutual recognition of professional qualifications and dedicated dialogue.
That protectionism that you're talking about from Europe.
Yes, and to agree with Paul, mutual recognition of professional qualifications is limited in its benefit if it doesn't come with mobility. I recognise your professional qualifications, but you still can't come and work.
Maybe a vote upon us very shortly, but I think we may just have time for one more from Dan Aldridge.
Okay, so to what extent is closer EU alignment compatible with the UK's independent trade policy that we've heard so much about over the past year, I suppose? So, and what should be prioritised, if anything?
So this is an area that we're going to do quite a lot of work on this year, just trying to understand that now that the UK has signed or almost signed most of the trade deals that are probably available, how do we now tessellate those with a different and deeper relationship with the EU? Sean, I don't know if you want to maybe just open the batting.
With every trade deal, you pool sovereignty, and I think that's an important starting point. In terms of alignment and dynamic alignment, this is where we see the quick wins going forward rather than pursuing single market access or customs union. The customs union, and being outside of this, has given us advantages as we negotiated with the US. We have a lower tariff with the US at the EU. So we wouldn't nail our colours to single market customs union just yet. But dynamic alignment and alignment where it is in the economic interest of the UK makes sense. It makes sense for our businesses, because if the same rules are in the UK as they are in EU 27, and therefore I do not need extra bureaucracy, administrative costs, it is a saving that can be pulled back into companies, into business, to meet the green transition, the digital transition, improve living standards. These are all things.
Can we be clear yet about the range of industries where that would make overall sense?
I think where we would say...
This time last year we weren't quite clear, but maybe 12 months on...
We think the areas that are more in that old traditional goods sector and manufacturing, services to a lesser extent, and particularly in the area of AI, where the UK has gone a different approach to the EU, which is pretty draconian. New industries, let's not align just yet. Old traditional manufacturing goods, provision of goods, it makes sense.
I suppose I would go back to the point of what is the point of trade agreements, and we want trade agreements that are going to support British businesses and good quality jobs here in the UK. So the Chair made the point right at the outset, the difference in terms of the economic value of the separate trade agreements that we've got now, not to sort of downplay those, compared to the potential benefits of a stronger, closer relationship with Europe, I think are on a completely different scale. I go back to the point, nobody quite knows what a customs union type arrangement might look like. I don't think most people think it's just going to be straight sort of, here's the customs union. Thinking about, for example, how the UK would be able to influence the EU's external tariffs and what mechanisms you might put in place to do that would be important. But I've got no doubt at all that the interests of the people that we represent are best served by a closest possible trading relationship we can have with the European Union. And I think we would need to work through some of those issues in terms of the separate agreements that we've already signed in light of that.
Okay. Final question then. What would your instruction to ministers be? So we've got a summit coming up at some point. We don't quite know when that will be. I think the UK wants it earlier. The EU perhaps wants it a bit later. But what are your messages to government now and to ministers to crack on with, Paul?
I think that the government is absolutely moving in the right direction, Chair. I'd urge them to be ambitious and to think about outcomes. And I say, for me, the outcomes are, what's the best possible arrangements to make sure that British firms are successful and the people who are employed in those firms have good quality employment. And some of the sectors that are most affected, that we've been talking about in terms of impacted by those customs arrangements, are some of the most productive parts of our economy. We talked about automotive, about steel, about aerospace, about chemicals, for example. I'd also encourage them to use those social partners, to use trade unions and others, because we are talking directly to our counterparts in Europe, and we want a set of relationships that works for workers in Europe, but on our side of the channel as well. So use those social partners.
Perfect. Thank you. Sean.
Well, I echo very much what Paul said. Speed. Be ambitious on SPS and ETS. These are the kind of first tests. But I would go further on two things. Yes, engage with stakeholders, businesses, large and small, not just those that you talk to most of the time. but also the devolved administrations, because I think this is going to be vital, because SPS agreement, some of the responsibilities, or quite a few of them, will be devolved responsibilities, so involved at devolved administrations as well. And do stick to the principles, because negotiating with the EU 27 is going to be difficult, but it is in their interest to work with the UK, given that the US is no longer a reliable partner.
Do you think that there is an opportunity to accelerate talks, given that uncertainty that now bedevils our relationship with the White House?
I think if you look to the statement of Commissioner Sefcovic and Minister Thomas Simmons at the end of the year, the fact that they want to have something substantive on SPS and ETS by this summer shows the indications that we want to move at pace on this.
Just make one final plea, Chair, is that the government needs to talk about what impact this has on real people and real families and their household incomes. People need to know the impact of that bad Brexit deal on their supermarket shop and on their energy bills, and talk about it in those terms, because this is going to be something you're going to need to win people's hearts and minds. It's not just about the technical negotiations.
Yeah, that's an excellent point on which to conclude. Thank you very much indeed for such clear and candid evidence, and for setting us up so well for our conversations in Brussels a bit later on this month. That concludes this panel. That concludes this session. Order.